this civilization lose a piece of knowledge that's central to its functioning? Well, the only scenario I can come up with is an increasingly autocratic elite ordering everybody around until finally there is a populist revolt, and those people and their books and their buildings are all put to death and burned. This may be a similar thing may have happened to the Maya. You know, the Mayan civilization, looking at the archaeological evidence, was an incredibly steep social pyramid. So steep that it's conceivable the execution of a few thousand people. What you've got left are rainforest swidden farmers, and then they go and do what they've always known how to do. I don't believe in the case of Soma that it could have been a matter of it being available and then slowly disappearing. I mean, the Rig Veda speaks of intoxicating hundreds of people a day. It speaks of the Soma gushing from the Soma presses in these enormous amounts. Well, clearly it was something easily available, obtained, and processed, and yet it died out completely and was not really replaced with anything else. So why? I think cultural institutions are more fragile than we imagine. In the scenario, and this brings up the issue of substitutes. In the scenario I told you yesterday about psilocybin in the Sahara and how it created a partnership paradise which then faded as the mushroom faded, as I try to imagine how that would have felt, I think probably what happened was at some point in the African past, the mushroom was everywhere on the grasslands. Whenever it rained, it appeared. It rained frequently. The cattle, the dung of the cattle was everywhere. The mushroom was everywhere. Well, then it began to dry up. And the first thing that would happen, and we're talking millennia in each step, the first thing that would happen is the mushroom would become seasonal. So then you would have great mushroom festivals once a year rather than continuous mushroom taking, seasonal. The next thing is, as the drying continues, it would retreat into the rain shadows of mountains seasonally. Now you have to make pilgrimages, long distances, seasonally to the mushroom place. Well, in parallel with this diminishing supply of mushrooms would logically be a rising anxiety about that. So what would you do? Well, you would create strategies for the preservation of it in times of scarcity. Smoking meat, burying eggs. Primitive, Aboriginal peoples know how to do these things. The obvious method of preserving mushrooms, still used to this day in the Sierra Mazateca, in a world without refrigeration, is to put them into honey. Honey is an antiseptic medium, and the sugar in honey will draw water out of a fragile thing like a mushroom and tend to preserve it. The problem is, if you've ever dealt with Aboriginal honeys, you know they're not like the stuff we get in the little plastic bears. Aboriginal honey is very watery, and what the consequences of this is that the preserving medium, honey, itself has the capacity to transmute into a psychoactive substance, alcohol. So suddenly you see people of good intention trying to preserve their mushrooms, but unbeknownst to themselves, they're turning into an alcohol cult, because fewer mushrooms, more and more honey. Then, and as the supply continues to shrink, finally you give up on intoxicating everybody, and you just say, we're going to establish a professional class of people, shamans, and they will take the mushroom since we can't all take it. So then you have knowledge of it retreating into a professional class. And these, in Aboriginal society, these professional classes are always hedged about with secrecy. So then you actually have a situation where there is a body of cultural knowledge which not everybody possesses, in fact, which very few people possess. Well, at that point, through war, epidemic, schism, or natural catastrophe, you could lose that core of experts, and then you would simply be adrift. So it's a very complicated issue, and the history of each one of these things is fraught with these kinds of episodes. The other thing is, just to keep the complexity ever before you, styles of usage change. I mentioned that the 19th century ate hashish. We smoke it, and it has very different impacts on our psychologies and our art and so forth and so on. Another example is a good example close to home, LSD. In the 60s, you couldn't play the game unless you took 500 mics. These days, you split half a blotter. It's probably 70 mics, and that is what people call an LSD trip. It's half an order of magnitude smaller than what was being done 30 years ago. Well, so naturally, people say entirely different things about LSD now than they did then. The other thing that makes this very complicated, I mean, nature is not cutting you any slack here, is you can have a species of a plant genetically fairly defined and taxonomically fairly defined, and it can have a horrific number of variables bearing upon it. The favorite example here would be Amanita muscaria. Yeah. More ink has been spilled over Amanita muscaria than almost any other plant I can think of. Wasson identified it as soma, the subject matter of these ecstatic hymns of praise that filled the Rig Vedas. But when you actually take Amanita muscaria, if you only get a bellyache, you're lucky. This is not at all a reliable intoxicant. Well, what's going on here? Well, here's what's going on. Amanita muscaria, because of its genetic makeup, is subject to geographical variance. That means the Siberian Amanita, the New Mexico Amanita, and the Andean Amanita are experientially different creatures. So, geographical variation. Then there is edaphically induced variation. Depending on the soil and the mycorrhizal host, the chemistry of the mushroom will be different. Well, then there's brood differentiation. The first flush will have a different chemistry than the third, fourth, or fifth flush of the same organism. Again, this is where the guru may have a role to play. You shouldn't take Amanita muscaria unless you are with someone who says, I have taken these mushrooms from this place at this time of year in this fashion and attain success. But if you just go out and eat the first Amanita muscaria you find, your experience could range from nothing to a medical emergency. And very few people who have just gone out and eaten Amanita muscaria have any kind of experience that could be mapped over an ecstatic hallucinogenic experience. But occasionally you will hear a story so wild that you can tell under certain very narrowly defined conditions this thing must be tremendously effective. But what those conditions are, we don't know. Yeah.
I think it was Lawson that wrote about, I guess it's the Rig Veda, talking about drinking the piss of Shiva and the Soma and this whole thing, and his interpretation, maybe it was more than interpretation, the evidence showed that they would drink the urine of the animals that ate the mushrooms. like the antelope or the reindeer or the cows. So that way it was purified of these toxins through the animal's system, and they would drink a potion that was...
Well, yes, I mean, I really respect Gordon Wasson, but in this particular area, I think he spread more confusion than light. It is certainly true that Amanita muscaria is a shamanic intoxicant of great age used among the Arctic peoples of Siberia in the Tunguska and Amur River Basin. But, and it is true that one of the great hazards of Amanita taking in that area is that when you go out on a snowy night to take a whiz, these reindeer come and knock you over head first in order to get to the yellow snow because they're so into it. But reindeer are not cattle, and there are no reindeer in India, and cattle don't seek out mushrooms to eat them. The thing that, to my mind, breaks down Wasson's theory is, first of all, the inadequate intoxication. But second of all, you can tell from the Rig Veda that hundreds of people were being intoxicated with this stuff, that basically people were just lining up and passing through a line and it was being ladled out. Well, Amanita muscaria has a mycorrhizal relationship to birch and spruce. That means it grows only in association with the roots of those plants. To this day, no mycologist has ever successfully cultivated it on the natch. So when you find it, it's a rare thing. To find one or two is cause for rejoicing. To find half a dozen is a miracle. I've never heard of anybody finding more than that. I've seen other amanitas in great abundance. If you're an Amanita fan, check out Baker's Beach in January. You all know where it is? It's at the bottom of 25th Avenue. The number of Amanita pantherinas that come up in that sandy soil down there, you can literally gather a couple of grocery bags of it. But even at that, how far will a couple of grocery bags go if you have several hundred people to intoxicate? So I don't see how it could possibly have been Amanita muscaria. I think a whole bunch of mistakes were made by Wasson and the people who followed him in arguing so strenuously for that. Wasson himself admitted that he never obtained a satisfactory intoxication from Amanita. So again, you have to be aware of all of these variables, and I think it's fine to respect those who have preceded us into this. Lots of hard work has been done, but on the other hand, they're just fallible, career-mongering human beings like all the rest of us, and it never hurts to double-check. I mean, what you haven't confirmed for yourself, you should view as simply informed speculation, but you do need to check for yourself. Yeah.
That's the whole mushroom versus, say, an isolated psilocybin.
Oh, meaning the pure compound? Frankly, in 30 years, there has been very, very little chemically purified psilocybin. I once took a small white capsule that was said to be pure psilocybin. It may have been. It was like a very warm and friendly flavor of LSD, but it didn't have the voice. Now, there's a famous story that when Hoffman isolated psilocybin, he then, to prove the isolation, he manufactured some, and then he and Wasson took it back with them to Huautla, and they gave it to Maria Sabina, and she said, the spirit of the mushroom is in the little pill. But let's face it, Maria Sabina was a sly old woman who really knew how to play on the gringo's harp, And I don't think it's the last word that she said that. I mean, the implication may have been, and so why don't you go back to Basel and leave us alone, for crying out loud? Haven't you done enough good here? Yes, I mean, I don't know quite what to make of this. Again, there are more questions than answers. But one of the things that you will quickly experience if you get into this, and most of you probably already know, is that rational, and by that I mean statistically extrapolatable expectations seem to be superseded on these trips by a kind of magical connectedness. All kinds of strange things happen on trips that really happen. It's not hallucination. These things really happen. It's almost as though the ordinary laws of causality are obviated and you become a magnet for the strange, the peculiar. And sometimes these synchronicities are trivial. Sometimes they're the difference between life and death. As an example of the latter, I've told this story before, but one time years ago, Dennis and a girlfriend of his went up into the mountains behind Boulder, and they took Argyria nervosa, Hawaiian baby wood rose, and it was much stronger than they expected, and it lasted much longer than they expected, and so night fell. And behind Boulder, up around Nederland, it's 12,000 feet. I mean, when night falls, the temperature plummets. You're immediately in a situation of crisis. Night fell. They were completely lost. They had no clue where they were or how to get back to the car, and it looked grim. And so they're looking out over these valleys and mountains and so forth, trying to spot something. And finally, across the valley, they see what my brother assumes is a car come around the corner because they see the headlights. And so they descend down into this canyon. It takes them an hour. It's pitch dark. They climb up the other side, and they to arrive in a parking lot to find their car. Not only to find their car, but to find that the lights are on. Well, they had left the car some 12 hours before. The battery would have been run down if the lights had been on all that time. It means the lights, they saw the lights come on when they looked out across the valley full of fear, wondering where they were. So, you know, it's just a story, unless you're the person whose life was saved by this incident. So, and you can see then why Aboriginal people would have this faith in the primacy of mind, probably because mind is in fact primary, and it's only because we've locked ourselves down into a set of reductionist expectations that we live in a world so brutally under the aegis of laws like entropy and seriality and so forth and so on. Yeah.
Something that Sasha said in the book, that you and him had a disagreement about synthesized mescaline, saying that, similar to her question about suicide, do you still hold that the two are different? Yeah, and that plant spirit doesn't really speak to you unless you use the plant itself rather than the compound.
I don't know, much has been made about this difference we had. I don't recall the conversation and haven't read the account of it. If Rupert's theory holds any water, it's the same thing, and we can both still believe whatever we like to believe. I think that without argument, though, generally the plant experiences are richer, and it's not difficult to see why. If you take mescaline, you have a mescaline trip. If you take peyote, you have a mescaline plus 13 other mescaline-like alkaloids, anhalamine, peyote, lophophorine. There's a whole spectrum of these things in there. And I think that gives a more, a richer experience. It's not an absolute ontological difference between Sasha and I on that issue. Where I might argue that there is a real difference is between drugs created yesterday in the laboratory and drugs that have a huge history behind them. Because I believe that in some sense, I mean, this is not rationally defendable, but it's an intuition. In some sense, when you take a plant, it takes you. And you make a contribution to the high. A tiny, it's like you add one brick to the wall. So that then essentially when you take psilocybin, you are experiencing all the previous psilocybin trips that ever were. That's what the psilocybin trip is. So I remember once when years ago, the first time I did ketamine, my impression was it's an empty vessel. It's an unfurnished hotel. It's a blank canvas. It's a psychedelic experience, but it's incredibly impoverished in that not enough people have done it to fill the space with stuff for the rest of us. Now, in 1,000 years, ketamine may be a very rich experience because so many people will have carved their initials on that tree. But I think, as we learn from the plants learn from us, and they adjust the content. So I'm not of this school that says what we need is a drug we don't have. Somebody wrote an essay called "What We Need Is a New Drug," quoting the lyrics of the song. I think that we have the substances we need. What we don't have are the techniques and the intelligence to know what to do with them.
So that is the active ingredient, and they do seem to give completely different highs.
Well, not if you take enough ayahuasca. If you take really a lot and sit and breathe and work with it for an hour or so, you can eventually get to a place where you just say, this looks like a DMT flash to me. But that's a lip-numbing dose of ayahuasca. Harmine has a slightly anesthetic effect. So if you take a dose of ayahuasca and your lips go numb, you are definitely topping out. That's an effective dose. Many people have never felt that, but it's a sign that you're approaching the effective limit. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the alleged CIA testing theory on people in a mental hospital in Menlo Park in the 60s that can keep people pardoned?
The Langley Porter experiments, yes.
I was what happened with those theories, what the government found from those, in relation to, you were saying that, that the studies in the University of New Mexico are going to be, the new studies, and I think those are going, what came out of those.
I can't really answer in detail. Those were not pharmacodynamical studies. They were more like psychotherapeutic studies. They were giving mescaline to people and working with states of dysfunction, but they weren't trying to understand the physiological parameters of it. Joe Adam and the guy who became the regent, Willis Harmon, all of those people were associated with those experiments. Mescaline was well studied during the 20s. I mean, if you've not read Heinrich Kluwer's book on hallucination, it's a very nice piece of work and done very early. And he actually tried to create a vocabulary of hallucination. I mean, it's kind of silly, but he taught his subjects to identify colors by their place in the spectrum. So people would say, spiked basketball moving at 4 o'clock, 700 nanometers, shifting toward 800 nanometers, and this sort of thing. which it doesn't quite give you the flavor, I'm afraid. Yeah.
We were in the plant culture and consciousness class the other day, and the definition of hallucination came up. And Ralph Messner was teaching the class. He was saying that for him there's a distinction between a hallucination, seeing something which isn't there, and the experience that you have on psychedelics where you're tapping into what you were talking about, the fourth dimension, that boundarylessness. I wanted to hear.
Yeah, no, that's worth talking about because I use the vocabulary in a specific sense, and if I don't explain it, I'm not really understood. There is a definite distinction. I mean, most people who've never taken these things think, well, don't you see colors, and isn't it like that? There are at least three discussable stages here. First of all, there's what's technically called hypnagogia. Hypnagogia is when you close your eyes and you see little lights and stars and drifting debris and that sort of thing. That's hypnagogia. Then there's what I would call, I guess, hallucination. And there's a spectrum. And it's very interesting when they simulate or talk about hallucinations, they only talk about the onset of hallucination. When you take a psychedelic, here's the timeline. Let's say it's psilocybin. At 1 hour, you begin to feel the state of arousal, give or take a few minutes. Well, then, when you close your eyes, there's this black background that is typical of the baseline of consciousness. Well, then, after a few minutes, there are these sort of amoeboid, after-image colored lights that come toward you and stream past you. And this is actually called streaming. This is how it's referred to. And these things are either that after-image violet or that after-image chartreuse that we all know. And these things sort of come, but and if you don't take a sufficient dose, that's it, with theme and variation. And now we're in the land of the famous geometric grids, floating shapes, this sort of thing. But that is not the payoff of psychedelics. The real payoff is visions. And visions are not dancing mice and rows of little candies doing calisthenics and all that detritus. Vision is something which has emotional content. That's why light shows and fancy computer graphics and all that, they stop short at this point. Because no matter how visually complicated something is going on a screen, if it doesn't somehow touch your heart and your soul, then it's just a complicated pattern of some sort. But if it also contains information specific to your circumstance, then it's completely engaging. And that's what I shoot for and consider the visionary trip. It's coherent. It's not like a dream. It's not that coherent. It's not a little story in which you appear in a strange circumstance with odd people. It's not like that. But it is not simply a visual experience. The content is multidimensional and deeply mental and largely informational. And that's the proof of the pudding. And there is no way to achieve it any other way that I've ever noticed. Relative to my remarks this morning about orgasm, and this is part of the clue, I've noticed that in the post-coital aura, if you want to put it that way, there are these blue and green lights streaming past, usually not for very long, maybe a minute's worth after a completely satisfying sexual release. But it doesn't go to the next level, which it always does do with the psychedelic. But the fact that they share that phenomenon for a moment suggests something, suggests that It's both. And I used to think not. I used to think it was entirely dose. But I've realized from talking to people that what seems natural and obvious to me seems odd to some people. What you have to do is you have to look at the back of your eyelids with the expectation that you will see something. And it's a plane in the field. Now, if you're in front of the plane, that means you're thinking, oh, I'm getting high, I feel weird, my agenda is this, I need to think about that, do I need to go to the bathroom, where is the water? You know, your attention is here. If your attention is beyond it, you also won't see it. Like I've noticed, you can't talk and see it at the same time. The act of verbalizing requires so much mental focus that you can't see this stuff. So what you have to do is look at the back of your eyelids as though it were a flat surface and just keep looking at it. And keep looking at it, and if there's any flicker of color or light or movement, concentrate and keep looking. Concentrate and keep looking. And it usually doesn't take more than a minute or two of that for it to completely open up in front of you. The other thing is, I plead with it. I address it. And I say, do what you will. I'm entirely yours. Please don't hurt me. But do with me what you will. And if that invoking, that announcing that you are ready is very important. In this matter of the speech of the mushrooms, the reason a lot of people don't have that experience is because you have to initiate the conversation. You can be loaded for hours on mushrooms, and if you will never say, in the silence of your mind, it doesn't have to be spoken, but you must say, hello? It will never directly address you. It's shy. But if you will say hello, it's there. It says yes, and you're off. And, you know, another thing, we're so defensive and locked down. Another thing that's very important, and all Aboriginal people know this, is the importance of chant and song. If you get into a hard place, the Western reflex seems to be to assume the fetal position and wait with the belief that in some hours, if you don't go mad, this hell, whatever it is, will be lifted off of you. Well, this is the worst thing you could possibly do in that situation. If you get into a place that is difficult, sit up, gulp air, and sing. And the reasons for this are obvious on different levels. First of all, it's an assertion of your existential right to be. You don't just whimper and fold. You sit up, you sing. Second of all, it oxygenates your brain. And mental though these places may be, they have some root in matter and physiology. Flood your brain with oxygen, and the demon, whatever it is, will be washed away, or at least transformed. And so, you know, by techniques of invocation, of chant, of song, of concentration, self-discipline, and I don't mean rigorous self-discipline, nothing like what yoga demands. I just mean, you know, pull yourself together, for God's sake, and pay attention to what's going on. You can make it your vehicle. And then the other thing, which I always do, but it's controversial, I suppose, to say it, is cannabis. Cannabis is the rudder on your ship. If you come into a place that you don't care for, just take a hit of cannabis and then do your chanting, and you will move through it. But don't clench. Realize that you are an energetic system, and the addition of cannabis or oxygen or water is going to change the situation. So take responsibility, and then finally, you have to discipline your hind brain. In the presence of the strange and the overwhelming, the primate locks into a fight or flight syndrome. But it's an adrenaline release. And adrenaline is a very short-acting compound. All you have to do is wait, and the fear will come, and it will spike. And if you don't go mad and start screaming or tear your clothes off and run into the street, but if you just sit, it can't sustain the spike. It chemically is impossible to remain petrified for very long. Eventually you just say, well, all right, so I'm terrified, so what about it? And then you begin to drift down. So it's not an easy thing, but it can be mastered, and it's mainly practical attention. The more exotic techniques, mantra, yantra, physiologically unlikely positions and so forth, that all works as well. But I think just breath and sound and cannabis and intent will carry you through most difficulties. Yeah.
I have a question about cannabis. When I was younger, I could smoke very easily, readily, at any time, whether I was sitting in class or playing soccer, or any time. And it would feel very good and calming, and I'd just kind of be stoned. And after a while, and now I can barely smoke anymore because I get really kind of sketched out. Not really paranoid, but a little bit like that. I'm just wondering,
You mean you feel uncomfortable with yourself in social situations? You don't know what to do?
Yeah, like even when I'm alone, like I can't just sit. I usually end up, I don't know, wanting to go mountain biking or something, run up a hill.
Well, I think our responses change over life, not only to drugs, but to other things. I think also you have to find what works for you. I know people who take LSD in small amounts very often because they say they can work better on it. I tried it. I felt I wasn't getting enough work done, and they said, oh, well, you'll be able to do 12 hours of work a day if you just take 50 mics after breakfast. I couldn't do it. It sketched me out. I found myself pacing the floor, and, it was madness. I, on the other hand, can, before breakfast, smoke enough cannabis that most people would simply go back to bed, and that sets me up for hours and hours of work. So you sort of have to learn yourself. These people who are these enthusiasts for datura, they've got to be some different kind of person than I am, and because they genuinely take pleasure in something which would just drive me right up my tree. So one of the things that you have to honor in this domain, more than in most human endeavors, is our human uniqueness. I remember years ago I took a course. It was a funny course, too. It was called Forensic Pathology, if you can imagine. And it was taught by, if you can imagine, Sasha Shulgin. Forensic Pathology, right? So one of the things he did in this class is he brought in a little vial of some substance. And there were 500 people in this class. It was at Cal. So we passed it around. No big deal. You sniff it, a kind of a nondescript odor, pass it on to the next person. Out of the 500 people, 3 had an incredibly violent reaction to this stuff. And then Sasha explained there is a known gene for reacting to this thing. People who have this gene are 50,000 times more sensitive to this substance than people without it. Well, just extrapolate that range to every substance in nature. And you will see why, in a sense, learning what drugs you should and shouldn't take is as big a task as deciding what kind of person you should or shouldn't go to bed with, what kind of investments you should or shouldn't make. In other words, it's a lifetime task of mistake-making, learning, self-observation, and correction. And what's sauce for the goose may not be sauce for the gander. And you have to honor your individuality. The shamans say, you know, if the plant wants you, it will take you. You will know if there is a lock and key fit. And I think part of late adolescence is drug experimentation for this purpose. I think if you go through life taking vast amounts of drugs of all sorts, then you didn't quite get it right. The idea is to find what works for you and then put the pedal to the metal, you know. And if it's LSD, you know, and if it, or whatever it is, because the things have personalities. It's like making a friendship. And some people are going to want to be your friend, and some people are going to think you're a jerk, and you don't want to hang out with those people because they make you feel bad. Yes, in one of my books I said, if you're thinking of taking a substance, you should ask yourself 3 questions. First of all, does it occur in a plant? Because that tells you that at least it is not toxic to organic systems. Does it occur in a plant? Second question, does it occur in a plant with a history of human usage? If the answer is yes, then you have your human data sample. If people somewhere have been taking this plant for millennia, then you know that it doesn't cause blindness, miscarriages, madness, tumors, so forth and so on. And the third and narrowest gate is, does it have an affinity, a relationship to ordinary brain chemistry? Because you don't want to insult the physical brain. You don't want to damage yourself in this enterprise. The psilocybin will pass this test. Stretching the rules a bit, LSD will pass this test. In other words, LSD is a relative of compounds that have been used for a long time. Whether or not it's a constituent of brain chemistry is debatable. But now the interesting thing about applying this test, you might say, oh, well, what a downer, everything's getting tossed out. No, the strongest stuff remains. DMT passes this test with flying colors. It's already in your brain just as you sit here. It has a long history of human usage in many parts of the world, and it occurs in many, many species of plants. And it is the strongest hallucinogen known. So this is a reasonable test to apply. That's to avoid basically danger and damage. Then once you've done that, you have to figure out of those candidates remaining, who is your friend, who you have an affinity for.
Whether it's friends that may or may not be positive or helpful, like this, I wonder if you know anything about that.
I don't really know anything about it. I do think it's puzzling when you feel that the initial conditions have been recreated, but the results you get are completely different. And astrology then offers itself as an explanation. Well, the last time you did it, the moon was in Taurus, now it's in something else. Again, this is something that could be looked at. Is there a time? I don't believe everything the mushroom tells me. I just treat it like everybody else, you know. You can't trust anybody 100%. But the mushroom does seem to have the idea that it's good when the moon is in Scorpio. I've just experientially noticed that things seem to go better in the psychedelic realm when the moon is in Scorpio. I'm a triple Scorpio. Hey. Well, they're probably smoking kinnikinnick and aboriginal tobaccos and various things. You know, it's a very odd thing. I mean, you talk about cultural evolution and that sort of thing. Did you know that smoking was unknown in Europe and Asia until it was brought from the New World at the time of the Spanish conquest? Rome never smoked its opium. It put it in wine. Opium was never smoked in China until after tobacco was introduced. In fact, the smoking of opium in China arose largely as a result of trying to drive out tobacco smoking as a habit. This method of drug delivery, which you would assume was Paleolithic, was unknown to the civilization that we evolved in. The New World seems particularly expertise in these dimensions. For example, enemas are one of the very few things that we can that have entered our culture as a cultural contribution unique to the Amazon basin. Enemas they had rubber, they had natural rubber, and they discovered that some substances were so toxic that you didn't want to put them into your stomach, but that they would be active if you would rectally insert them. And so the enema was invented millennia ago in South America, but was a mad idea from the point of view of European medicine until it was tried. And then, of course, it became the rage. And there are then successive rages of upper colon focus that sweep through our society every once in a while. Yeah.
What do you could expand upon the idea that you think about it about the plant as a model for consciousness and for culture?
Yeah, that was an essay that originally appeared in Whole Earth Review, I think called Plant, Plan, Planet. And what I was trying to say there was there is a great deal to be learned from emulating plants, especially in the culture of crisis that we're in. First of all, plants, they have to deal with their toxic byproducts because they can't move away from them the way we do and move into new niches. Plants are homeostatically self-regulating. Plants are small solar factories, essentially. Plants do all their work at temperatures below 115 degrees. Notice that we do our technologies operate at 600 degrees and up, and then produce all kinds of heavy metal toxins and poisons and this sort of thing. Also, in a sense, the Tao-like passivity of plants, the way in which they accept their circumstances. Essentially, an animal is an organism that can move away from the circumstances of its own being. And so, for all of these reasons, plants seem like an excellent model for the kind of future that we should be building. We want to go to lower energies. We want to go to more organic starting and ending materials in industrial processes. We want to create a kind of integrated homeostatic cohesion in our societies. In all these cases, and a solar-based society, in all these cases, the plants provide the model. They've been showing how to do these things very efficiently for a very long time. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Rick Carnes and Roth when they get together on the whole archetypal psychology that is specific related to the planet, and how doing people's transits or charts seems to be the only predictor? It seems to be very valid to predict the kind of journey or experience a person would have depending on the moment they
I've heard that from Rick. It's very interesting. I haven't actually looked at the data. The only reason astrology is not scientifically respectable is because no one can hypothesize how the coupling takes place. In other words, how can the transit of Mercury be coupled to an event system on this planet? But don't despair. We know that the sun radically affects the weather on the Earth, but no coupling system has ever been proven for that either. It's just the statistical correlations are so overwhelming that it's impossible to ignore. I think probably the key to understanding astrology is you're going to have to go outside of astrology to understand it, to something like fractal resonance. The reason the pattern in the stars is repeated in the pattern of your life is because there's only one pattern to begin with. It isn't that the stars cause you to be the way you are any more than that you cause the stars to be the way they are. There is not a causal relationship here. What there is a series of adumbrations and reflections that are, this is, a great discovery that has been made in the past 10 years, one of the greatest intellectual steps ever taken by human beings. A new law of nature is now discernible, and I can state it for you. It's that nature is self-similar across scales. Do you understand what that means? It explains why an atom looks like a solar system and why they both look like a galaxy. Because nature is self-similar across scales. It means that, if a certain architectural conceit works on one level, nature will use it on any other level where it seems appropriate. And so on many, many levels, the same patterns repeat. And so it wouldn't surprise me at all if in the next while we got the equivalent of astrology, but quantumology. Quantumology, where instead of calculating downward from the stars to the context of human fate, you calculate upward from the atoms to the context of human fate. And if you keep calculating, you can go from quantumology to astrology and leave out sociology and show, that these things are reciprocal reflections of each other. Then the mystery and the woo-woo of astrology, I think, would just simply disappear and be replaced by an, of course, how could it be otherwise kind of understanding. Yeah. Well, somebody said the thing that has changed least in Western civilization in the last 300 years is the classroom. I mean, this could be 1500. Everything else has changed, but what do? We come with sharpened pencils and sit and listen to elderly, lecherous professionals and to try and stay out of their clutches long enough to get a degree, and then we go out and play the game. I think that this is somewhat a field, but something very profound is happening in the way in which we modern people process information. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Marshall McLuhan, but McLuhan argued that an equally profound transition occurred with the introduction of print. Print is not simply writing that's easy to read and reproduce. Print is an entirely different creature than anything that had been produced before. It has qualities that no other medium has. Specifically, its linearity, its uniformity, It's interchangeability, and what I mean by that is that every A, every capital A, looks like every other capital A. They are interchangeable. When a friend of yours writes you a note, you look at it. That's the precondition to reading it. When you open a book, you immediately read it. You don't look at it at all. Very few people puzzle over how the A is sitting there on the page with that white back. No, we just read. And the difference between looking and reading is very great. McLuhan called it the contrast between a manuscript culture, which is ear-oriented, and an eye-oriented visual culture. Well, now what's happening to us, and I was talking to somebody about this at the break, is the rise of the image. The image is in the ascendant. Ever since the invention of photography, let's say, in the middle 19th century, followed by color photography, followed by color lithography, followed by moving pictures, followed by television, followed by the internet, VR, stereograms, and all the rest of it. Something is happening. Our culture is forcing our visual education. And I think one of the problems with education is that we are trying to use a print-created institution to educate electronically biased human beings. And it's created a kind of a speed bump of illiteracy. One of the things that is put against your generation, you Generation Xers here, is that you're not literary. You're not a literary culture. But and it's true, don't deny it. None of you can quote Milton. But I also think it's a temporary thing. Your children will not be like you. Your children will be fully visually literate. They will have assimilated this new medium and operate under its aegis, while you are in a transition phase. And so the kind of dumbing down of culture that has had to occur as we go from a fully literate culture to a fully electronic culture is, I think, transitional. I mean, everybody says, people learn everything from TV. Kids know every star, every show, every plot, and say, why do they know that junk when they can't memorize the sequence of U.S. presidents? Well, make a good enough TV show about it, and they probably will. Not that I'm a fan of TV, but I am a fan of the visual image, and I think TV betrays it to some degree. HD TV may correct that, but it gives psychedelics an interesting role because they are such stimulants to the visual imagination. It's almost like they lead us deeper in this cultural direction that we have great appetite for. And now, with CD-ROMs and multimedia and websites and all that, we just can't wait to show each other stuff. Everybody's building a website. Everybody wants to invite you over to see their latest visual creation. And I think that language itself is headed in this direction, that our language is literally becoming more colorful, more sparkling, more engaging, and it's because it's becoming more visual. And eventually it may be an entirely visual exercise. The rise of icons is an interesting example of this. That now wherever you go in the world, if you will push yourself just a little bit, you can understand what's going on because signage is so iconographic. It doesn't matter whether you're in Germany or France or Argentina or where you are. The signage is in an international language of visible symbols that unite us all. You see, the thing is, the word is ambiguous to a far greater degree than the image. And so when we communicate in words, we communicate incompletely. If we communicate in images, it's much closer to fulfilling the intent of communication, which is to erase the boundaries between the messenger and those the message is being sent to. Yeah.
What you're saying is like, I feel like the return to the archaic, because there was a time when people didn't read and they had to get their information by one image, whether it was going to certain things, things like window, or, but if it was fulfilled in like a picture with 1,000 words, you know, looking at your 180 messages, if each one could just be a visual image, then you could have done that quickly.
Well, that's why I called my book, one of my books, The Archaic Revival. Because you see, I really think, the thing that McLuhan was trying to say was that every medium, be it print, he even treated the electric light as a medium. Every medium has a hidden agenda, which the users of the medium are not aware of until it's too late. For instance, in his discussion of the automobile, it was invented to convey people from place to place. In practical terms, what it was a bedroom away from home. And a whole generation of people discovered sexuality much earlier than they would have because of the automobile. That wasn't its intent, but that was its effect. Similarly, McLuhan says you could never have the concept of the citizen if it was not preceded by the invention of movable type, because the citizen is an interchangeable social unit the way a letter is an interchangeable unit in typography. Also, the linearity of Western thought is a product of the fact that when we communicate in print, we arrange our thoughts in lines. That isn't done in some languages, but in ours it is. Well, then we impute that quality of our communication method to reality itself. My hope is that through holography and virtual reality and HD TV and a deep awareness of McLuhan, that we could create what I would call a biasless media. In other words, it would be a media that would do to you exactly what reality does to you, instead of pushing you in some other direction. And it would be then a return to the archaic. And it might be technically very sophisticated, but the final impression must be, I am not looking at a screen, I am not turning the pages of a book, I am not listening to earphones, I am really having this experience and it is really real. I've never heard the VR prophets talk about it as a biasless form of media, but I think that's what we're headed for. Well, when media becomes biasless, media becomes reality.